I was educated as a sociologist. We were taught to be parsimonious. One of the dictates or imperatives of our craft. After listening to the talk that you all heard and I just heard, so similar in its detail, in its argument, in its conclusion to what I thought I was going to say, that probably what I should do in the interest of parsimony is say, I agree, thank you. It's uncanny. It is as if there was a conversation between the two of us, which did not take place. Perhaps it should have, now that I see it. Okay, thank you all for being here, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here as well. As a white Mississippian, it's hard for me to think of issues more important to my generation, to my state, and to my region than those to which this conference is devoted. So, as a consumer of all of this, as Jacqueline said, it is a feast indeed. The title of my piece is called Race, Memory, and Historical Responsibility. What do Southerners do with a difficult past? In his novel, Requiem for a Nun, William Faulkner used one of his characters, Gavin Stevens, to observe, quote, the past is never dead, it is not even past, unquote. The past, Faulkner seems to be saying, is recalcitrant, stubbornly refusing to go away or to be discarded. The past reminds, makes us who we are, and sometimes, when we acknowledge that past, it also makes us wish we were not who we are. It fuels death and destruction, and it spurs acts of sacrifice and greatness. The past both illuminates the present and at the same moment obscures it. The past renews, even paradoxically, as it defies newness. In its inevitability, the past is always everywhere, persisting into the present and thus presaging the future. The past is often coated with nostalgia's soothing patina. Think about Jimmy Carter's autobiography, for example, which is really an enjoyable read. But some recollections, those of historical injustices, are anything but soothing, and they are especially likely to cast a long shadow. When in the mid to late 1960s, the American South, for instance, was finally forced to abandon its long nightmare of white-on-black racial violence and state-mandated segregation, I feel as if you have heard these words before, that period we call Jim Crow, the region resembled in important ways what are now known as newly democratizing transitional societies. These societies, Argentina, Chile, South Africa, many other nations in Latin America and Africa, and just about all the former Soviet bloc nations in Eastern Europe, traded dictatorial or authoritarian rule for some form of liberal democracy, however weakly democratic practice may have been institutionalized. New regimes in such emerging democracies must confront difficult, often exceedingly painful pasts. All such transitional societies, and here I most definitely include the American South, face at least three interdependent problems of what is called in legal scholarship and social science, transitional justice. The first is how, if at all, to hold the old regime's autocratic, often violence-laden leadership responsible for its wrongdoings while in power. The second is what, if anything, to do with the thousands and thousands of ordinary folk whose participation in and compliance with the old regime help legitimate and thus perpetuate wrongdoing. And the third task is how, if at all, to deal with the victims of the old regime. Transitional societies have attempted to solve these challenges in a variety of ways, but the restorative mechanisms they have used to deal with both wrongdoers and victims can be grouped into four broad and non-exclusive types. First are the criminal trials of those who, by the standards of the new regime, committed crimes against persons. Restorative justice here thus literally takes the form of criminal justice, bringing the wrongdoers to the hall of justice. Second are truth and reconciliation type commissions, about which we now have had a wonderful introduction and discussion. What I refer to later as TRCs, in which the victims of oppressive regimes tell their stories in public and wrongdoers confess their crimes, also in public and often in return for amnesty. More than 40 nations in the last 20 years have resorted to some form of TRC. The third form of restorative justice is reparations of some form, reparations being literally acts designed to repair the original undamaged relationship between individuals and collectivities. Reparations run the gamut from apologies to the injured parties to monetary payments, health, education, and other social services, and on to memorials and other symbolic forms of historical reckoning and restoration. Both apologies and material reparations have been used by dozens and dozens of countries, including the U.S. most specifically in terms of material reparations to Japanese Americans for their incarceration in what were called internment camps during World War II. Finally, there are purges, whereby members of the old regime are fired from positions of authority and barred from further employment in certain jobs, or similarly, where their government pensions are void, or as was done in Brazil, they are subject to informal social ostracism after having been identified in a TRC type setting. Some form of purge was especially prevalent in the 1990s in the former Soviet bloc nations of Eastern Europe, especially what was then Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Now, with this in mind, I return to the American South, and especially to how we have not confronted its hour on its difficult path. I stated earlier that the region after 1965 or so was akin to these newly democratizing transitional societies about which we were speaking. How so? The first point of comparison is that until the late 1960s, when the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and the the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed and implemented, the region was not constituted to be, nor did it function as, a small d democracy. Say for the Mountain South, for example, the region was more or less a one-party state with the party of white supremacy, the big D Democratic Party, firmly ensconced in power. Second, large percentages of African-American citizens, perhaps as many as 2/3 of the region's black vote, were deliberately kept from the ballot box. In Mississippi in March of 1965, just months before the Voting Rights Act was signed, less than 7% of African Americans in the state had been permitted to register to vote. Most did not because of fear of retaliation, justifiable fear. The third profoundly undemocratic element in the political and racial cultures of the South was that at least part of the region, particularly in the Deep South, permitted neither freedom of assembly nor freedom of speech. Each of these three conditions, and most perniciously their confluence, severely weakened the representativeness of government and the machinery of democracy. The second point of similarity between the region and the formal autocratic or dictatorial transitional societies was the widespread, quite deliberate civil and human rights abuses here in the South, mainly against African-American citizens, but not exclusively so. As Renee pointed out, white people who aligned themselves with the movement, or indeed would even listen to some of the arguments, were themselves punished both economically and otherwise. Finally, we in the region were very much a people divided by race. I need only allude to the systematic soul-numbing exclusions, the hint, or more than a hint, of violence to be unleashed at any time, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Unfortunately, death came all too frequently to the South. More than 4,000 black folk, likely more, were lynched by white mobs during the time of Jim Crow. So again, we were in the mid-1960s, the people divided, a quarter to a third or so of the South owned, without much in the way of cultural legitimacy, physical security, economic comfort, or political voice.